You want to do? Okay, I can move it out. Then I'll turn this off.
I've been pretty good. How about you?
I've been great.
What are you doing with yourself? Thank you for coming, by the way.
The world. Second time back since February 20.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Mahmoud Farouk on behalf of Arizona State University Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, School for Future of Innovation Society, and the Global Futures Lab. Welcome to the ASU Washington Center. This is our second New Tools for Science Policy Breakfast seminar this year. Welcome some familiar faces. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, in person and also online. The format is a 30-minute talk, 30-minute Q&A, and then we'll break for networking. John is going to take a little bit longer, but we try to keep it for within an hour. So, you have time to go back to your work, and it causes least interruptions in your day. The idea behind the tool series we started is to create a space for exchange of science policy knowledge between academia and practice. And it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome John Alic back. Dan Serwitz, who is our co-founder and here today, used to refer to John as his go-to guy for anything having to do with R&D innovation and also military. And so I'm really, really honored to have him here. He brings a deep and penetrating insight and historical perspectives regarding our R&D enterprise. So usually, John is asking questions that nobody is asking, and we usually get to appreciate that in hindsight. But we have a little change of situation here, because you see, he was going to give this talk in February 22nd. So, 6 weeks later, I think military budget and strategy are once again in a part of our national conversation. And we get to appreciate his question now in real time and as an added dimension to the dialogue going on right now. So I'm going to give the floor to John. And John.
Thank you, Mahmood. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I've been a big fan of CSPO for a long time. I'm glad to see the in-person series starting again. Let me kind of give you a sketch of what I'm going to say before I get into the detail. My basis for what I'm going to say is the premise. Actually, I think it's an established fact. The technological change is fundamentally evolutionary. And the analogy is something like punctuated equilibrium. You have occasional big waves of change. Punctuated equilibrium is, from the geological record. Big changes every once in a while and kind of stasis in between. That doesn't mean everything stops. Means the rate of change is slow and incremental. The whole process is path dependent. Where you are today depends on where you were yesterday and last year, and in the case of the military, in 1945, 1950, 1960, because there's been remarkably little change except in things like spending and what we spend it on, since really the Korean War. A lot of scholars, academics, thought that there would be a big change with the end of the Cold War, but it didn't happen, as we can see today in Ukraine and so on and so forth. Policy, too, is evolutionary then in this sense. And our policies towards the military have not really changed all that much over the last, 50, 70 years. So I'm now going to talk about S&T advice, technology and science advice to the military. And the military kind of set the template for how we do S&T advice in this country. The pattern was set really during World War II. And after the war, during the war, I should back up just a minute. During the war, as I think you all know, Vannevar Bush and the Office of Scientific Research and Development really ran R&D. And they handed off systems when they were, ready for production engineering to the military. The military ran procurement. Bush and OSRD ran not only R&D, but system design, really, for things like radar and also jet propulsion and, of course, the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. So there was really no civilian advising to speak of at that time. There had been some experiments in the 1930s. They didn't last long. The National Academy of Sciences, of course, had been around for a long time, but they were slow. They didn't do much. They weren't deeply involved. They're a little more involved today, but still, they don't give kind of hands-on real-time advice, which is what is often needed. Civilian agencies in the 1960s and later really kind of replicated the military mechanism. I'm going to talk more about the military mechanism in just a minute. But they set up boards, independent boards, outside boards, for questions that had to do with things like, regulatory policy. There was OSHA and then EPA in 1970. EPA quickly set up a scientific advisory board. And so did the R&D agencies, because they needed advice on, what are the cutting edge fields of science that NSF, for example, or the Energy Department with their big science projects, what should the priorities be? So they look to outsiders for that. This process was far enough underway by 1972 that Congress passed FACA, which is the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And the reason for that was that these agencies had started to proliferate their advisory processes, but often the boards were secret. They didn't want people to know who they were listening to, and there was a lot of suspicion in particular that the Nixon administration had stacked the advisory boards at places like OSHA and EPA with industry advocates, and that they weren't really getting the kind of balanced advice that one had hoped for. So the intent of FACA, which is still around, was to regularize the process. Now, back to how the military does this. Hap Arnold, Henry H. Arnold, four-star general, ran the Air Force during the Second World War, really drove what happened. And he went to Theodore von Karman, who was one of probably with Prandtl, the top aerodynamicist, fluid mechanics expert in the entire world. Von Karman had come to the US from Germany in the early 30s. He was at Caltech. By the time Arnold tapped him for his expertise, he was, very well connected, very well known. He was world famous. And why did Arnold do this? Because he knew once the US was in the war that its aircraft really weren't all that good. They were outmatched, as some of you probably know, early in the war by the Japanese Zeros. They were outclassed by British fighters even earlier in the war. And so the question was, how do we make sure that this doesn't happen? How do we get good advice so we move forward with our military aircraft, get the best kind of technology out there? Because, war depends on having good systems. So Arnold put von Karman to work on this. Von Karman tapped the people in his knowledge network to try and figure out how to do better. And after the war, this was something that was broadly endorsed by all three services, because by 1945, it was plain to officers and enlisted personnel equally that the good military equipment made all the difference. It wasn't the only thing that mattered in war fighting, but it was very important. Again, just anybody who watches Hollywood movies knows the story about the tanks. And if you remember, trying to think of that one, what is it, Kelly's Heroes, where the American tanks had to creep up behind the Germans because that's the only way they can knock them out. Anyway, in the end, technology had a lot to do with winning the war. It wasn't the atomic bomb. It was really radar more than anything else. The US had a massive lead in radar by 1945, but that was not fundamentally a US innovation. We got microwave radar from the British and developed it further through OSRD. And that was another telling example of what the military would have to do in the future to make sure that something like this, this kind of mediocrity in our military equipment didn't happen again. But at the same time, the senior officers in the military, they really resented the fact that civilians had controlled R&D and systems design during World War II. The military had always run their own show. They didn't like giving it over to civilians, but they had no real choice because, fighting the war was much more important. Procurement was a massive deal, great, industrialization and so on. And it made sense to let let civilians run R&D during the war, but Vannevar Bush started to ramp down OSRD in, if my memory is right, early 1944, when it was plain that the war was, that the Allies were going to win the war. And by 46, 47, OSRD was gone. The military was back in control. Did they know how to do this? Did they know how to run R&D? The answer to that is no. That's one of the reasons why our systems were inferior early in the war. In the 1930s, Air Force systems development at Wright Field in Dayton for all bombers, in fact, I think all multi-crewed aircraft, transports and bombers, was run by one officer. And he was a pilot and he had maybe 3 subordinates. And it took hundreds of people to design those aircraft. There's no way that 3 or 4 people at Wright Field could ride herd, much less figure out whether the right thing was being done. So the military had to reinvent how to run R&D and systems design in the early stages of procurement. And in doing this, 2 things happened. Basically, Arnold set up the first military scientific advisory board formally, with a name and a roster of experts and a charge. Von Karman headed that. But at the same time, one of the things the advisory board told the Air Force and the other services to do was get yourself officers who are technologically literate. And they tried to do that. The Air Force in particular started sending officers back to graduate school, often in engineering. When the Air Force Academy was set up, it was engineering centered, as the Naval Academy had been for a long time, because ships at sea plainly have to be independent. You have to have technologically competent people on the ship to fix it when something goes wrong. If you're in an airplane, you land it and the mechanics come out. And if mechanics can't fix it, they get, further help and so on. Same with the Army and the tanks. There's help at hand, not true at sea. So the Navy was actually somewhat ahead at this point. But they, in their own way, had to take a new look at the way they were doing things. And among other initiatives by the Navy, they got Congress to legislatively establish the Office of Naval Research in 1946. And that was an important step, engineered by some relatively junior officers who had worked on nuclear affairs during the war, and they could see that nuclear propulsion could be important for the Navy. That was kind of the impetus for doing that. So you had ONR and the Air Force and the Army both set up kind of, cloned that kind of organization, but without legislative authority for it. Now, this was a period of intense conflict. The armed forces had wanted to continue to run the Manhattan Project, the post-war work on nuclear weapons. Congress and the White House gave that, after big fight, to the civilian-managed Atomic Energy Commission, the ancestor of today's Department of Energy. But otherwise, the military did have control with von Karman heading the committee and so on. That did not last very long, because Arnold, who was in ill health, retired, and he, in fact, by 1950 had died. And his successors were of a somewhat different mold. They thought that the military ought to run things. The military always had run things. The Air Force had been run by pilots. And the pilots, again, really took charge. Now, it took some time for this to happen. But over a period of, half a dozen years, the services, all of them, kind of co-opted unvarnished civilian advice from experts like von Karman. And let me give you a particular example. The Army followed the Air Force in setting up a scientific advisory panel, as it was called at that time in 1951. And it was headed by James Killian. Killian was a famous scientist, president of MIT from 1939 onwards. I'm sorry, I said he was a scientist. He was not actually a scientist, but he was an experienced administrator and deeply plugged in to the elite scientific community that kind of was in charge of governmental advice of any sort at that time. He was the first head of the Army Science Panel. Later, he became Eisenhower's first science advisor and the first chairman of the President's Science Advisory Committee. That was in 1957. So the Army started out right. Today, as of 2020, retired military officers make up more than a quarter of the Army Science Board, as it's now called. And the chair is described in his bio, which you can find online, as having managed global sales and distribution channels for a succession of defense contractors. So a very, very different person from Killian and von Karman and their peers, including people like Oppenheimer, who was the first chairman of the AEC's advisory board, the General Advisory Committee, which played a very important role at that time because the AEC, when it took over the nuclear program, had only one technically qualified person among the commissioners. That was Robert Bacher, who'd been a deputy to Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. And so the AEC had to rely very heavily on the General Advisory Committee, which had a long list of distinguished scientists on it, to figure out what to do, how to build the program, how to respond to the military demands, because the military wanted more and more nuclear weapons of more and more different designs. That, of course, got Oppenheimer in trouble. I won't go into that. Again, I'm sure many of you know about that. By the time Eisenhower was in his second term, it was plain that the military was going off in some strange directions in their search for kind of winning weapons. And Eisenhower, who more than any other president we've ever had, except maybe George Washington, understood the military and knew how to, work with the military and try and get them to see things his way. So he ran defense and national security. His defense secretaries were basically administrators, and he had a lot of conflict with all three services throughout his 2 terms in office, which he managed quite well, quite quietly, and without ruffling a lot of feathers. And sometimes he let them have their way, and sometimes he didn't. But by the time of Sputnik in 1957, 1958, it was plain that something had to happen. And because Sputnik, of course, was a big shock to particularly civilians who didn't expect it. So he set up PSAC with Killian in charge. Killian was a science advisor. This was done by executive order. And on the congressional side, of course, DARPA was created then. But more important for our story, since DARPA is a research agency, was Congress legislatively established the Office of the Director of Research and Engineering. And their charge was more systems design and putting civilians in control of the overall architecture of what the military wanted. And DDR&E was very important for a time, as was PSAC, but their influence, again, the military kept chewing away at that, and they had a lot of support in various places in Congress, and a lot of controversy over choice of weapons. And I'm going to give you 3 brief stories about some of these weapons. The first is aircraft nuclear propulsion. The idea here, which both the Air Force and the Navy wanted, was to basically clone nuclear submarines, but in the air. The idea being you could cruise the skies indefinitely. If you were in a Navy reactor-powered plane, you'd be searching for Soviet submarines, you know, their snorkels and so on. If you were an Air Force general like Curtis LeMay, who was kind of running Strategic Air Command at that time, you would cruise the skies indefinitely in your nuclear reactor-powered bomber carrying nuclear weapons, because the Air Force worried that their B-47s and B-52s could be caught on the ground in a surprise strike and destroyed before they could take off. There's a lot of that during World War II, and that made a deep imprint on the Air Force generals who come out of that war. The aircraft nuclear propulsion program spent about $1 billion over 10 years or so. That'd be about $10 billion in today's currency. The scientific advisors repeatedly told the Air Force and the Navy that this wasn't going to work for obvious reasons. Reactors are really heavy. You need a lot of shielding just to protect the crew. Planes do crash. The Air Force and the Navy at that time were losing 75 to 100 planes a year in peacetime crashes. And what happens if a plane with a nuclear reactor on board crashes, in a populated zone? What happens if it crashes anywhere? You've got a really messy situation. Plus, the planes would have to be really, really huge. Let me go back to Robert Bacher and read you a quotation from him. Bacher, remember, was the guy who was an AEC chairman, been Oppenheimer's deputy, and later he was on PSAC, President's Science Advisory Committee. In an interview in oral history, he said, over the years, there must have been a dozen or more surveys of the aircraft nuclear propulsion program, and I don't know of one of them made by technical people that came up with an affirmative recommendation. Well, that didn't stop the Air Force and the Navy, and Eisenhower probably could have stopped them, but he didn't want to. He had, I think, bigger battles to fight over things like, nuclear strategy itself. Okay, the next little story is a plane called Dinosaur. This was going to be a space plane. You'll note the resemblance to the space shuttle. But this was in the 1950s too. This was another Air Force solution to what they saw as a problem of dropping nuclear weapons on the interior of the Soviet Union. At the time, the early 1950s, ICBMs were still in the future. Nobody quite knew whether they would work technically. The Dinosaur space plane was going to take off from the United States. It was going to fly above the atmosphere, skip off the atmosphere skip off the, the upper atmosphere. That was the soar part of Dyna. And it was then be above Soviet air defenses, which were pretty good at that time. Remember, the Soviets shot down a U-2 when Americans thought that the U-2 could fly above Soviet air defenses. So this was going to be in inner space, not outer space. It would get over the Soviet Union, would swoop down, drop its nuclear bomb, swoop back up, and fly right back to the United States. Well, could the space shuttle do that? Of course not. Could the National Aerospace plane, that was a big deal during the Reagan administration, do that? Never happened. This wasn't going to happen either. Another $10 billion gone. The next slide is another view of Dinosaur. This is from one of the trade press magazines at the time. Now, what's going on here? The big difference between what the military does and kind of civilian S&T advising is that the military works with big systems that are really complicated, involve dozens or hundreds of trade-offs. They're very costly, multi-billion-dollar systems, and it's different in a lot of ways from, sorry. Okay, didn't hit the button right. It's different from the kind of S&T questions that come before agencies like EPA and OSHA, which primarily have to do with regulations and with research funding. Well, research funding is not that big a problem for DoD. They have to decide like everybody else, but it's systems design and procurement. The military has 75 plus big procurement programs going at any one time. Systems like nuclear powered aircraft carriers and submarines, the F-35 fighter. Now they're working on the next generation stealth bomber. There's ICBMs, so on and so forth. The Army, I'll tell an Army story in a minute, but the Army has its own kind of system design and development problems. These are fundamentally different from what civilian agencies worry about, with some exceptions for NASA and missions into space and for big science. If you're going to build a hugely expensive telescope or an array of geological sensors or something, there's some commonalities there, but nothing like the scale of what the military does. The military spends about $150 billion currently each year on procurement of these big, complicated systems. So who does the work, the design and development work? Well, the defense industry does. In theory, the military rides herd on that, but they don't do a very good job, in part because, because it's very difficult and because they don't have the kind of hands-on technical expertise, and because the civilians don't have much of a voice in this. Most of the decisions are made by military officers, and while some military officers are very highly skilled technically, there's famous stories about the ICBM program and so on that I won't take the time to go into. By and large, the people who make the command decisions in the military are not technical experts. The military has something 50 plus R&D labs still today. They're almost always run by military officers, colonels, Navy captains, and above. And they're on relatively short tours or there for a couple of years. They don't want to be there because that's not the route to the top in the military. The route to the top is commanding troops in the field. It's not managing a laboratory. So if you talk to people in the labs, they will tell you how gingerly they have to try and manipulate the military people who run the labs. That's an organizational issue that's common, of course, in everywhere really, but it's particularly prominent in the military. Now, what has happened to science advising, technology and science advising as it applies to the military? The first thing is that PSAC, which Eisenhower had set up, kind of withers away. It was strong during the Kennedy administration, but after Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson paid less attention, and he got advice from PSAC in the course of the Vietnam War that he did not really want to hear. So he stopped paying attention. Nixon basically had the same kind of attitude as Johnson did. He didn't want to hear things that he didn't like from PSAC or anywhere else. And he did in two prominent cases. One, the supersonic transport, which he favored and PSAC said is a bad idea. And two, ballistic missile defense, which Nixon wanted as much for political reasons as anything else. And PSAC kept telling him wasn't going to work. So in the end, Nixon basically abolished PSAC and also the White House Office of Science and Technology. Now, Congress recreated kind of a facsimile of that a few years later. That's OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which we still have today. But OSTP has been almost entirely fenced out of military affairs. This was quite deliberate. And much the same happened with DDR&E, which was, remember, there to put civilians in charge of what the military, their system level technical choices. DDR&E was strong for a time, and then it kind of deteriorated. The DSB is the Defense Science Board, and you can read that quotation from 205. But before that ever happened, Nixon's first Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, reportedly took the job only on condition that PSAC, which still existed at the beginning of Nixon's term, not have anything to do with the military. And Nixon wanted him as Secretary of Defense for good reason and accepted that as far as is known. Afterwards, DDR&E, never really came back. Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's first Secretary of Defense, was even more willing to give the military whatever they wanted than Laird was. Laird had good reason. Laird was trying to wind down the Vietnam War. Weinberger didn't. Weinberger didn't know much about defense. He didn't know much about technology. He just, shoveled the money to the military. And DDR&E with its kind of, by that time, devalued staff could not really stand up to this kind of pressure. The quotation from the Defense Science Board is from a task force report on the roles and authorities of the Director of Defense Research and Engineering. And that's a fairly critical report. The Defense Science Board, which I kind of skipped over before, reports on the civilian side of the Pentagon, not the military side where the Air Force Science Advisory Board was, the Army Board and so on. That's the military side, which is huge, with millions of people. The civilian side is small and is powerful because the Secretary of Defense is the head. DSB is there to advise the Secretary of Defense. And sometimes they give good advice, not always. They're better than the Army science, than the military science boards, mostly, I would say. That's my personal opinion. Okay, now a digression to say that just to give you, I want to give you an idea of the size of civilian science advising at this point. There's now something like 1,000 FACA registered committees. The Agriculture Department has the most. They have more than 150. Most of the agriculture committees don't have much to do with S&T. FACA is advice of any kind from non-government employees. But about 2/3 to 3/4 of the FACA committees do have something to do with science and technology. And their members are registered, and the census shows there's something like 70,000 now. This is totally different from what it was in the 1950s and early 1960s, when a small clubby elite of people like Oppenheimer and Bacher and Killian kind of, you know, they were the center of everything that happened. It's not at all like that now. Now we're getting to near the end, in case you wondered if I was going to keep on going half the morning. So let me go back to the military's particular problem. It's not a research problem, it's a systems design problem. This is a report done for DDR&E back in the 1960s, and I think it makes the point very clearly. It needs all kinds of, you know, clusters of know-how to make a complicated system, whether it's a ballistic missile or a nuclear submarine, an aircraft carrier, ballistic missile defense, whatever, work effectively. It's not one thing. Like, in some sense, even dealing with COVID is one thing. COVID is a tough problem. It's a systems problem too, but it's more socio-political economic systems and technical systems. And the military, you know, is not in the same ballpark as that. To put it another way, much more succinctly, this is J. Keyworth. He was something, an exception to the withdrawal of PSAC and science advice from prominence, because Keyworth was a big advocate of Reagan's Star Wars. But this was an outlier. This was very unusual. The reason Keyworth took on that role is that he believed in Star Wars. He was a protege of Edward Teller, who, you know, sold Star Wars as much as anyone else, or tried to. And the military really didn't want to get behind Reagan's SDI concept. There were other things they wanted to spend the money on more. They were really worried that Star Wars would suck money from their own priorities. So, but Keyworth, who was a weapons scientist, he recognized that science advising is easy, technology advising is hard. And if there's any one point that I'd like to drive home today, that's the point. Now, a brief story about the Army, because I want to make another point, which is that the boondoggles, like the aircraft, nuclear propulsion, dinosaur, have not ended. This is spending on the Army's future combat system, which was in the early aughts. This is all R&D spending. Again, it adds up to about $10 billion. It led to absolutely nothing. It was a misguided concept, a hugely complicated system of, you know, robot planes and robot helicopters, robots on the ground, tanks, some of them with people in them, some of them without, you know, jeeps, armored vehicles, all networked. Every soldier was going to have a computer, blah, blah, blah. It was driven by a vision that was divorced from reality. That was obvious at the time. It was pushed into place by the Army Chief of Staff without the usual reviews that in theory are supposed to prevent this kind of thing. Frank Kendall, I should say, was not there in the Pentagon at that time. He came in at the end. He saw the program was already dead. This was his verdict. He's still there, and I owe this quotation, by the way, to Dorothy Robine, who I think is listening over the air, because this was from an article he wrote in one of those obscure defense journals that you just can't possibly keep up with all of them. So anyway, she called my attention to this, and I think it gets the message exactly straight. So the last two slides first deal with the underlying issue is that the military is really, they're experts in war fighting. They're not experts in technology. They want to call the shots on technology. They really aren't in a position to do that effectively. As the Army Chief of Staff, that was Eric Shinseki at the time, have shown us multiple times over the decades. Secondly, and this is a much broader problem than just technology, people who deal with national security, in the large, will tell you that there is just mutual incomprehension between the White House staff, much of the National Security Council staff, and the uniformed military, and also a good deal of mutual incomprehension between the civilian side of the Pentagon and the military side. Again, the civilian side is small. There's a lot of turnover. People come and go. Some of the people, like Caspar Weinberger, come in without any experience, without any background at all. So OSRD, the Secretary of Defense, can in principle override acquisition decisions by the military service. Sometimes they manage to, sometimes even very strong secretaries of defense like Richard Cheney cannot. Cheney killed the Navy's A-12, which was hugely over budget and scheduled. He tried to kill the Marine Corps' tilt-rotor Osprey. He couldn't. He had too much support. Congress really likes the Marine Corps. Okay, so what should we do? I think you have to strengthen civilian control over systems acquisition decisions in the Pentagon. And the way you do that, I think, is not with structure. There's more structure than anyone can comprehend already. You need to go back to the kind of people we had in the 1950s, providing outside advice to the decision makers. So this is a case in which I think, we don't need new rules. We need to go back to the old rules for technology and science advising to the military. Thank you.
John, I didn't realize you would be talking about Hap Arnold and von Karman, because that was a chapter in my PhD dissertation. And I remember, most of the time we talk about Vannevar Bush and FDR, and Science the Endless Frontier. But von Karman actually was asked to put together also a blueprint for Air Force for the next 50 years. And the things, all the R&D development, from pilotless aircraft. I remember that's one of the things that was in the 1940s. So it's amazing to see that history mentioned again. Question, okay. Name and then.
Sure. Thanks very much, John. I'm Jeff Alexander with RTI, the Research Triangle Institute. And I've been dying to ask this question of somebody about the Jasons and a little bit about their story, especially in view of the fact that the Jason's contract was terminated by DoD last year, and they've apparently been revived now as kind of doing studies on commission for other government agencies. But what does that maybe say about the state of scientific military advice? That the Jasons was almost disbanded, and now they've almost become kind of like a consulting arm rather than a standing scientific board.
The Jason is kind of a legendary group, again, of elite scientists, for those who don't know. I can't remember, it goes back many years. And they are still around, they still do some good work. And there are other outside groups too. FAS, the Federation of American Scientists, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the think tanks like the Institute for Defense Analyses. There's RAND, which which Hap Arnold also set up, which now, I mean, is not really known for technical advice, but they do still give technical advice to the military. But I mean, I think the essential point is that once the military regained control of systems acquisition decisions by roughly 1960, you know, they don't have to pay any attention to advice they don't like, internally or externally. There are roughly 100,000 civilian scientists and engineers working in DoD. They all report directly or indirectly to military officers, minor exceptions only. You know, the capability, the knowledge is there, but it doesn't get tapped. And I think that's also true of JASON, DSB. Academy still does some good studies. Does it make much of a difference? Occasionally, not in general.
I have a million questions, but I won't ask them all. But the first one is, just quickly, I mean, this is such an interesting, unfamiliar kind of lens for looking at the military-industrial complex. Or is this going to be a book?
You can find a lengthy article in the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Military in Politics. It's called the U.S. Politico Military Industrial Complex. It's out last year, and I think if you look at the if you look at the CSPO,
I have an earlier draft of it.
Yeah.
So
So that's 20,000 words. It's not a book,
long enough.
It's longer than the usual encyclopedia entry.
And then the sort of more substantive question, because I think this is true in the civilian R&D enterprise to an extent too. Who's the constituency for change here? You're making a good governance argument, but there's a pretty powerful iron triangle which does things like preserve the Osprey system. So is there an argument about the consequences of not having the kind of oversight you're talking about? I mean, can we point to the failures in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan as in any way related to this? Is there any way to say, besides the trillions wasted, which no one seems to care about, is there any way to say, here's where the rubber hits the road and why we could do better?
I think that's a question that nobody can answer, Dan. You know, all these, every story is different. I think the heart of the problem is probably the lack of hands-on military experience by those outside the military, which is fundamentally different from the early post-World War II years and even after Vietnam. You had a lot of people in Congress and in the executive branch who had been in the military, who kind of understood things and knew where the leverage might lie and could talk and communicate with their peers in the officer corps. That's really not true anymore. There's only a few of those people still around. And I think this is kind of beside the point, but I think that I think it's wrong to have retired military officers at high levels in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, no matter how good they are at their job. It's just wrong. The civilian side should be purely civilian. That would help, I think. But, you know, strategic questions, warfighting questions, what happened in this war, that war, this campaign, that campaign. That's different, and rarely can one point to technical reasons for the, the questionable outcomes.
We have a question from Mark Brodsky online. He asks, was the development of drones relevant to this R&D and civilian advice situation?
Drones?
Yeah.
The military has worked on drones since the First World War. The first unpiloted aircraft was a biplane with a simple, electromechanical doodad system to work the stick that the pilot would usually work. And ever since then, the military has sought unpiloted aircraft, not always enthusiastically, because the Air Force wants pilots to fly the planes. So for a long time, drones were simply used for target practice. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but it's been, I think the answer to the question is, it's been an ongoing R&D theme for many, many decades.
Any other questions?
Sorry again, but so I'm working on a paper on the federally funded research and development centers, the FFRDCs, and especially looking at the history of, MITRE, which was set up to give technical advice on things like, air defense and Project SAGE. I'm kind of curious, how do they fit in compared to the scientists within the DoD? These are people who are technically outside the DoD fence line, but still obviously part of that community. And do the FFRDCs potentially have a bigger role to play now in providing that kind of outside advice, because they are quasi insiders in that way?
I think the basic way to think about the FFRDCs is it's a very mixed bag. I have great respect for the Institute for Defense Analyses. I think, to me, they're at the top of the list for the quality of the work. But again, that doesn't mean that anybody in the Defense Department pays much attention. MITRE does some good work too, but not always. And IDA does good work, but not always. Same is true of CNA and all the others. You have to look at the particular situation, the particular report, the particular advice, just like academy reports. They're all over the map. A lot of academy study boards that report to the military, they do whatever the military will pay them to do. That's also true of FFRDCs. They need the money to keep going.
Jeff and I could probably trade questions all day long, or at least as long as he'll sit there. But let me try another go at my same question, but from a kind of as a hypothesis. Yeah. So the hypothesis would be that really simplistic technological systems thinking is actually implicated in failures in wars systematically. And I'll start with your beautiful chapter in Trillions, John's great book on defense spending from early 2000s, about strategic bombing, and how strategic bombing theory, which was really technological system theory in a way, led to unbelievable waste of life and failed doctrine. Similarly, we see the idea that technological systems can win wars didn't work in Vietnam. In Iraq, it turned out that little bombs placed under sophisticated weapons could destroy those and wreak havoc. Afghanistan, all the interconnections among warfighting units from new communications technologies didn't make a difference. So is there an argument to be made that unsophisticated technological systems thinking actually is implicated in these failures? And one of the reasons I'm groping at this is simply the question of of, who is the constituency for these arguments so that a good political argument can be made for reinstituting the kinds of advice structures you're talking about?
That's another really tough question, Dan. Let me answer it in two ways. First, there is a long-standing stream of literature on and thinking on the relationship between technology and doctrine. And it's back to the early slides. It's an evolutionary story. Technology and military doctrine co-evolve. Doctrine is not quite the same as strategy. It's not quite the same as tactics. Doctrine to the military is how you fight on kind of an extended battle space, and what kind of systems do you need to do that. And those of you who are interested in that, I would commend to you particularly the work of I.B. Holley, Holley. He wrote a wonderful book called, in fact, I think it's called Technology and Doctrine, or something like that. Anyway, you can look him up. The second part of the answer, I think, to Dan's question is that it's like any other technology. Technology has to be fit to the task. If you're messing around with your car, you won't get very far with a crescent wrench. You need a set of sockets and box wrenches and ratchets and so on. If you're fighting in an urban environment, a Kalashnikov may be a wonderful weapon. It's simple, it's easily fixed, it doesn't jam, it's cheap, it's expendable. It's not sophisticated, but it's used worldwide because, it's a killer's tool. And the same is true with things like rifle-propelled grenades, Stinger missiles, so on and so forth. If the problem is one of worldwide command and control, and you want to get a signal to a submarine that's out in the Pacific or in the North Atlantic somewhere, well, that's a different kind of problem entirely, and you need sophisticated technology for that kind of problem.
Okay, we're at time, but I'm going to ask a question because it's in my mind for a while. What if now you're talking about civilian advice for the military. Now let's turn it around, military advice for the civilian. And the context for that is that there is this onus that the civilian side has about everything that comes out of military. And now especially with DARPA. So now there is an effort to set up an ARPA for everything that we can imagine. For the longest time, because going back to the quote you mentioned, science is easy, technology is hard. But for whatever all practical purpose, the industrial policy in the US has been the military, dictated by the military to some extent, the technology side of it. So how do you see this, because a lot of is missed when we look at, all the successes that came out and not all the failures that also happened on the military side. So what do you see as we see this proliferation of ARPAs and trying to bring some of the military approach to the civilian side? Do you have any thoughts?
Thanks, Mahmood. That's another very good question. I think ARPA-DARPA is widely misunderstood, in fact. It was created to drive advanced technology into a resistant military. It was not originally created to do kind of, far out research. That's always been part of its portfolio, but a small part of its portfolio. And of course, we all know that the internet came from the ARPANET. We know that military spending gave a big boost to the integrated circuit back in the 1970s when the military and space programs were the only market for that. But, where ARPA, DARPA, where most of its money goes, is in systems programs. For example, ARPA spent billions trying to design and prototype an arsenal ship for the Navy. The Navy really didn't want it, and that's a case in which the money was wasted. So the part of ARPA, DARPA that all these civilian agencies are trying to clone is a little piece of the actual DARPA, the piece that does pursue far out research. And, you know, DARPA does that because it's not something the military has ever really pursued on its own. And all these other agencies, they're in some respects also kind of inbred and sclerotic and slow moving. And I think the mission of these clones is to break some of these log jams. Now, whether they succeed will depend in part on where they're lodged within the agencies, who gets appointed, and the people that run them. I think people are much more important than structure. I think we lose sight of that and lose sight of bureaucratic politics and how you negotiate your way through bureaucratic politics in a lot of these discussions.
All right, so I think we're over time, so please join me in thanking John.
Thank you. Pleasure.